Want to state your name for the record?
William Seeders Mossheim of Seeders Instruments.
Seeders Instruments, and
Yeah.
I think, boy, if we didn't follow each other right off the bat, like I think we've been probably Instagram friends since like 2015 or something like that. Like,
Yeah, super early on for me.
Super early on, and I've been following your stuff and been amazed at seeing, like what I originally saw was pretty impressive, but it looks like you've been on a journey as well too, like ever evolving, ever morphing, ever maintaining interest in things. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, definitely. I'm somebody who never really stops exploring or trying to solve new problems or creating new problems for myself to solve.
Is that primarily so that you can make people like me feel like I've never accomplished anything in my life, or where's your goal with that anyway?
Yeah, that's the specific point of it. Yeah, okay. For sure. But yeah, mostly I just kind of never, I'm such a curious person, and I just like figuring out how to make things and fix things, and I have pretty serious ADD. Probably this good explanation.
So Seeders Instruments, when I first started following you, seemed to be building some open back banjos, a lot of playing of open back banjos. Seemed like you're doing a fair amount. What's changed since that time? Like, it looks like the shop is bigger. Is the shop bigger from that time, or is that
the same shop actually? Yeah. So the I can give you a little background of the shop situation it kind of puts it into a whole perspective. So my father is a custom furniture maker and has been my whole life. So I grew up in his wood shop. Some of the earliest memories I have are him handing me a piece of wood and a chisel and say, have at it, have fun, or sand this piece of wood. And I'd just be in there sanding a piece of wood for 3 hours or just chiseling away on things. And I started my business while I was working for him in my early mid 20s, making furniture for him full time. And I started my business nights and weekends. And I built up, after a few years, I built up enough of a backlog and enough demand that I ended up deciding to go full time with it. And out of the generosity of his heart, he gave me a little unused upstairs corner of the shop. And so I ran my business out of that little corner that was a little 10 by 10 space, having access to the greater shop, which is behind me now. But having my main 2 benches essentially in this little tiny corner of a room, and eventually kind of outgrew that space at the time when he was starting to think about stepping back a little bit and retiring a little bit. So as he's slowed down a little bit, I've picked up and started taking over more of the shop little by little.
Is this shop in an industrial area, or is this at one of your houses?
No, it's I live above it. So it is sort of my house as well, but it's a mile up a mountain in the middle of the woods. It's cool. A very picturesque environment.
Is your dad musical? Is he a banjo guy at all, or?
No, so I'm pretty much the only musical one out of my whole immediate family. And my father's a big music fan. He loves music. He introduced me to a lot of the music I love throughout my life, and he's a huge supporter of music, loves going to see concerts and seeing people play and hearing me play. But I'm the only one that plays instruments, and it was kind of what I have since I was 10 or 11. So knowing I was probably going to follow the woodworking path in some way, it kind of made sense to marry the two at some point. And I kind of always planned on it, and then it just kind of happened when it happened. I didn't force it at all.
So the woodworking, when I think of banjos, I can get my head around the woodworking part of it, but there's a fair amount of metalworking too, isn't there? Like, were you doing metalworking from the start, or do you outsource your metalworking?
No, so that's something that kind of I've been phasing in over the last 6 years or so, I'd say. And it's so to tie it back into the family thing, my brother, my older brother of 2 years, is a metal worker, and he's primarily an iron worker, steel worker. He does a lot of fabricated, a lot of grinding and welding, a lot of railings and architectural stuff. But along with this wood shop that I'm sitting in, right across the driveway is a full metal shop. And so I've got kind of a little bit of everything. And he's given me enough space. He gives me a lot of wall space to put lathes, and he's let me put now 3 metal lathes in there, and we've got a small mill. So having collecting those tools over the years, slowly ramping up to do more and more of the metal work. I used to just buy all my parts from the handful of hardware makers that exist in the banjo world, which are very few and far between these days. And just kind of wanting a little more control, a little more quality control, a little more consistency, a little more control over just designs as well. I've started to teach myself how to do all that work, which is mostly all brass work. So it's really, and it involves some other stuff, but kind of teaching myself machining and that world of it has been a really fun thing to explore, but definitely one of the more recent additions to my business.
Are you doing plating too, or are you sending out for plating, or?
Only minor plating. I have a little small plating kit, and I'm planning on upgrading that to do a little bit more. But a lot of my banjos are all raw brass and antiqued. So antiqued raw brass. And I don't get I've used a lot of plated parts when I was buying parts, but I don't have a huge demand for plating. And and I have sent parts out for plating, but it's not something I want to get into on a larger scale for all my stuff. But a lot of especially in the open back banjo world, a lot of the world has gone to raw brass or antiqued raw brass.
So are you 100% open back, or do you do any resonator instruments?
I haven't built any full resonator instruments yet. I've converted a lot of old Gibsons, and I work on a lot of them. And I have plans to. I just have such a huge backlog of open backs that I haven't really taken the time to set up for it yet. But I have a couple of my pretty high profile banjo friends that are in the bluegrass world and play resonators are really kind of like, when you're ready, just the floodgates are going to open, but I'm not quite ready to make that leap yet.
Is the world of so who's in proximity to you? Like I don't want to use the word competition, but like who's in the world now? Is Stelling still doing stuff? Is Deering still doing stuff?
Deering's probably the largest banjo company in existence, at least in the country, for sure. And they do both open backs and resonators, but their primary market, I believe, is still that good time banjo. I think that drives a lot of their business. And they have some higher end stuff. What was that?
Is it really a good time though? Like, is that?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't hesitate. It's one that it's not my top recommendation for banjo players, for beginner banjo players. It's not a bad banjo, but it could be a lot better. It's lacking some really important things that I think a banjo needs. Like a truss rod, for instance, is a really nice thing to have in a banjo, especially ones that move around a little bit.
Yeah.
And but I don't want to discredit what it is, because it is an excellent instrument made in the US and relatively affordable for that. So it's I definitely have recommended it a lot of times, and it's filled a good role that needed to be filled.
What about Wildwood? Is Wildwood still?
I don't think he's still going anymore. People that worked for him are. So as far as like, in the banjo world, none of us really feel like competitors because it's so small, and especially compared to the guitar world, it's minuscule. But I have to say since I have started, there's been a huge surge of small hobbyist makers coming into the market, and ones that have started little businesses, but they're definitely still, nights and weekends or part-time kind of thing. But the people that I would consider that are my competition in the level that I build at, as like Jason Romero, Brooks Maston, Kevin Enoch, Pete Ross, some guys like that. Some are larger than others. Some are more well-known than others. Some have been around longer than others. But then there's there's, you know, there, it's like guitars, there's a high range, there's the mid range and the lower range, and people trying to fill roles in each of those worlds. And I'm definitely landing on the lower high range is kind of where I like to live. I don't want to be the most expensive guy out there, but I don't want to be making affordable banjos all day, because it's harder to make a living at the level that I build at.
Yeah. So in open back banjos, like that, it seems like that, like I always think of it in terms of like, you know, old time and, you know, maybe, you know, fiddle accompaniment, that kind of stuff. Clawhammer, of course, comes to mind, but there's like a lot of different music styles and tunings and stuff for people that are really nerds for banjos, right? Like, is that?
Yeah, and the open back banjo in particular has really seen a big resurgence in the last 10 years or so, I'd say. And it might be because that's when I really started paying attention more. But I really think it's broadened musically a lot. I see people, you know, primarily I do see a lot of clawhammer players, old time players, but it's working its way. And along with those styles, it's working its way into the singer songwriting world, the Americana world, where people don't really find that the resonator banjos fit that kind of vibe or the sound or the tone they're looking for as much. So they're leaning towards open backs to find them, even though they're not playing that traditional music that it's been played with, you know, within for a long time. So that's been kind of fun to see.
Are you all 5-string all the time, or is there variances in strings?
There's variants for sure. I just most recently I just built my first 7-string banjo, which was a pretty wild project. So it was for a banjo player, but he's also a classical guitar player. So essentially it was a classical guitar like instrument, banjo instrument with 6 nylon strings and then the short drone string on top still. And it was fun because there is a history of early banjos being that. There was a number of banjos from the 1800s and turn of the century that were 6-7 string banjos. And so it's kind of fun that people are rediscovering these old configurations of banjos. And I do make some tenors. I've made a handful of tenors over the years. And I've recently introduced into some of the standard models that I make a 6-string banjo, which is like a 5.5 string, some people like to call it, which is a 5-string banjo, essentially just with an extra low string in there. So you've got, it's kind of like a 7-string guitar, you know, just sticking in. It's a little different though, because that string is in between 2 strings that you're used to. So it takes a bit of adjusting playing style wise, but it's the sound, you know, but with a little extra.
Is there anything with like plectrum necks or anything like that? Is there an open back plectrum variant? I've never seen.
Yeah, they definitely exist. They're a little less common. Vega made a number of them back in the day, but it's not something I've had. I think I've made 1 or 2 over the years, but it's not a common variation that at least I come across. And I know there's some people that do make them out there. Like there are a few banjo makers that specialize in tenors, and mostly like Irish tenors and plectrums. And I believe they make a few. I'm not too familiar with any names in that world as much, but it's a very small market for those for sure. But and generally the ones I have made are generally for guitar players that don't really want to figure out that short drone string. They just,
your sons of Mumford and whatnot.
Yeah. But a lot of them end up kind of going, oh, maybe I do want a 5-string. You know, it's a good intro, kind of like the tenor guitar was back in the day, you know, to get banjo players over to the guitar, you know.
Yeah. The amount of times I want to hear a flat pick on a banjo, though, open back's a little different, though. Like, some of those 6-string guitar banjos. Those are like,
they're
but no banjolins. Speaking of,
I think I've made 2 or just 1. I made a banjolin for a friend of mine, actually a close friend of mine. But there is a inherent problem with banjo mandolins, and anybody who's ever worked on one like yourself, I'm sure you know there's too much tension on those instruments.
A lot of tension over a little area.
Yeah, and the rim can't quite support it, even if it's really heavy. That there's just too much tension on those instruments. So
Plus
I'd shy people away from them for sure.
I mean, they sound like a toothache too. Like they're
Yeah,
just like, ugh, whoa.
totally. Yeah.
I imagine with an open back, I mean, all the banjolins I messed around were all resonators, and they would just like hurt you.
Yeah, very jangly kind of. Yeah.
So
Definitely, and there's just too much tension to keep all those strings in tune too. With the head and the flexibility of that is, you need as rigid of a surface as you can for those.
The other thing too is a mandolin is already doing a pretty good job of making that rack right. Like,
yeah, totally. Yeah, I've heard people do some good things with them for sure, and there's the banjo mandolins, but it's few and far between. That's for sure.
Yeah, take a real subtle person to those. So what would you like to do first? We talked a little bit about doing let's see, we didn't do much bio. How did you get into the banjo? Did you just like
by accident
drag you to a bluegrass festival or something? Or
no? Well, it's funny because I grew up hearing banjo music, and my father's, being such a huge music fan, he listens to all kinds of different genres, and I'd hear it a lot, but I never really had a big interest in it. And musically, as you mentioned, I play professionally a lot, and I've played everything from jazz to hardcore music, punk rock and jazz and blues and rock, and then so the kind of how I got into the banjo was a little bit by accident. I always had a little bit of an interest in it. I remember in high school, I'd borrowed a friend of mine's mother's banjo, and it sat in the case for 8 months, and I never actually took it out. It kind of intimidated me. And I've always been the kind of person to always want to learn a new instrument. I play a lot of instruments on stage, banjo, fiddle, guitar, bass, pedal steel, kind of anything with strings. But the banjo, and now looking back, that was a Bart Reiter banjo that she'd had and lent me, and it was a nice banjo. So it was kind of like I had this opportunity and never really quite took it. And in my early 20s, I was playing in a punk band at the time, and my friend who was the bass player, his wife had a banjo sitting in the corner, just a cheap Dean. And I got kind of burned out on the punk rock music scene. And I said, I'm sick of putting in earplugs. I'm sick of the attitudes. I'm sick of the anger. I'm just kind of like, I need something soft and mellow for a while. And I borrowed this banjo from her. I said, I think this is the time that I, play something acoustic, get back to acoustic music. And I borrowed the banjo from her and ended up buying it from her, 6 months later. And after playing that kind of crappy banjo for a year or two, that's actually what got me building instruments. I said, maybe this is the time that, I always thought about making guitars because I was primarily a guitar maker or a guitar player forever. And I said, maybe this is it. Maybe this is how I get into making instruments. I was looking around for a nicer banjo, and I said, these are a little expensive. I can't quite afford something that's a little nicer. I said, wait a minute, maybe my father and I can put our heads together and we can figure out how to make this. Figure out how to make a banjo. And we did it in a bubble. I'd never met a banjo maker. There wasn't a lot of information online at that time. There's a couple of resources, but not great. It was very much hobbyist makers just chatting about stuff. And we just put our heads together and figured out how to make a banjo. I made 2 banjos, and then a good friend of mine ordered he asked me to make him a tiny banjo for his 4-year-old who is enamored with me watching me play banjo on stage. He just would come up right up to the stage and just stare at me and like want to touch the banjo. So they're like, can you make him a little banjo? And I made him that little banjo. I figured out how to make a little 18-inch scale length with an 8-inch rim, fit in a mandolin case that a 4-year-old could grow into. And I officially started my business with that banjo because I was selling it to somebody, and made a little website and immediately got 3 orders for them. Because
Really?
nobody was really making them. Nobody was making these little tiny travel banjos. And that's kind of what kicked everything off. And throughout that, I was playing more and more and getting deeper and deeper into the traditional styles of banjo, learning bluegrass, learning clawhammer, and it just kind of took off. So it was a little bit by accident almost, but it was a little destined to happen because I'd had that interest in it for a long time, but I just knew nothing about it. And being in Southern Vermont, it kind of had to learn a little bit about it in a bubble where there wasn't really many banjo players around. It took me a while to find Will Fielding, who used to be here, who was an open back banjo maker who was in Southern Vermont. But there isn't a huge community around traditional music or banjo music in particular.
How much did your dad's furniture making inform your research on how banjos might have been made? I would imagine he probably has some. When you showed him a banjo rim, was he like, oh, I think I know how we could do this, or was it just trying from an absolute void, I guess, of knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely, and that's one of the things that I've always said that has informed my building in a lot of ways and helped me get to the level that I was at a lot quicker than I may have otherwise, is having the woodworking background.
Yeah.
When I built my first banjo, I was already making some pretty high-end furniture, and I understood joinery, I understood finishing, I understood wood, and just how to, and having all the equipment that I have already. I wasn't working out of my garage. I wasn't working out of my attic or anything, or my basement. And I was working out of a full professional wood shop. So I had that advantage from day one. But my father's the kind of person who's like me, just varied in style and approach his whole career. And he's made everything from kitchen cabinets to pool tables. And it's definitely informed a lot of my building style, but we did have to figure out a lot. And I didn't start steam bending my own rims until years in. I was doing brick laid rims, segments of a circle and stacking them up.
I remember seeing that. I wondered if that was a choice, or if you were always trying to get to the steam bend one.
Yeah. And it was always kind of a dream early on, but I just didn't have the time. Basically, early on, I didn't have the time to really set up and figure it out, or I was just kind of, that worked for what I was doing, and I just wasn't quite ready to figure out, because I'm the kind of person that I never really, I need to kind of figure out how to do it myself in a way. And I have a couple mentors that I've met over the years that have really helped out a lot, but I'm the kind of person that go, I see a problem or something I want to do. How am I going to do that with what I have around me and what works for me and what I'm happy with the outcome? Mm-hmm. I've never been the kind of person to just pick up the phone and say, hey, how do I do that? I'm going to do it exactly like you do it.
Would it feel like cheating?
Yeah, sort of. For me, it almost does.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. But, in the years since, though, I just finished setting up a new rim laminating process that after I steam bend, how I laminate all different plies together, I got directly from my friend Richard Newman, who's a master furniture maker and banjo maker since the 70s. And he's very much under the radar, but he's also the guy that gave Ken Parker a start, for instance. He was like a big mentor to Ken Parker, and Ken worked for him in the 70s, and they're close friends. So he's adjacent to some very well-known luthiers and has been a very big influence in that way. But he's one of those classic overthinkers, over-engineers, who's just a master at figuring out how to do things, and he's just on to the next thing, figuring out how to do things. So he's very under the radar in that way, but he's been really instrumental to me.
Is he local to you there, or?
He's in Rochester, New York.
Okay.
So close enough I can get to him in a day, but we don't see enough of each other, that's for sure.
Yeah. Are there banjo festivals that you guys all meet at where you might
there is one that's in the fall. It's called the Banjo Collectors Gathering, or now it's kind of switched to the Banjo Gathering, and that's actually where I met a lot of people in the banjo world. Well, actually, I'll take that one step back. I met a lot of those close friends who are banjo makers that were a big influence on me, who became friends, and we all help each other out and do things for each other whenever we can, but who I've learned a lot from at Augusta in West Virginia, where when I was first getting into pearl engraving, I was kind of, I was trying to learn that in a bubble too. And it was really hard because it was all, yeah, that was a tough one because it was all, gun engravers and jewelry engraving, which helps, but it's a very different approach. Mm-hmm. And also sort of a guarded world in some ways. And I was making some progress. And then a class popped up at Augusta during their trade school in the summer of Kevin Enoch teaching pearl engraving. And I said, Bill, this is a once in a lifetime chance. And I jumped on it and I went down, and that's where I met Kevin and my friend Pete Ross, who worked with Kevin for a while, and Richard, Bob Smacula, and some other folks in the banjo world specifically. And it just kind of all took off from there. And that's when I found out about this collectors gathering that happens somewhere on the East Coast. It bounces around year to year. Wow. And a lot of people that are in the retail banjo world are in that world too. Like Stan Werbin of Elderly Instruments was usually there every year. John Bernunzio, and people that really kind of gave a lot of old banjos a lot of high profile, and really kind of found a lot of these old instruments that a lot of my work is influenced by. And it was definitely a very eye-opening experience getting to meet a lot of those people and finding my way to that gathering. And a lot of us, we go and we'll bring some banjos, some of us more than others. And usually I'll just go just as an excuse to hang out with my banjo nerd friends. Yeah.
How many people your age are hanging out in there? Are those guys like replacing themselves or thinking about kind of the legacy of that banjo information at all?
Yeah, I think that's starting to happen more these days. I'm definitely one of the young guns for sure. Mm-hmm. My friend Pete Ross, I mentioned, he's just a little bit older than I am. There's a handful of others, but a few have come and gone. People come in and out. It's a really hard, as we all know, it's a really hard way to make a living being a luthier, and especially making custom instruments. And not, I do both custom, my own designs, repair, restoration, kind of anything I need to do. And it all keeps me really busy, but it's a hard way to make a living. So
is it also, are you kind of in competition with how many banjos were actually produced? I mean, there was a time when this country was building banjos like it was part of a war effort or something.
Yeah, totally.
Like it seems like there's like a lot of banjos hanging around. Like if somebody wanted an open back banjo, like it seems like they're available. But
yeah, well, actually an interesting thing has been happening over the last few years where every one of us that's a smaller maker is just crazy busy.
Yeah.
And just cannot keep up with the demand. And my friend Patrick at Pisgah Banjos, he's trying to compete with Deering's market and the kind of lower, the higher low end mid-range instruments, trying to make 300 banjos a year, and he cannot keep up. And there's Deering still making a lot of banjos, Ohm's still making a lot of banjos, and the market is definitely growing, it seems, which is it's a nice thing to see. And the popularity of the banjo when I was a kid, and we all kind of have had this experience of the banjo is the butt of a lot of jokes.
It can be, yeah.
It definitely can be. As almost any instrument has its moments with that, but the banjo in particular really, mm-hmm. Deliverance didn't do us any favors, that's for sure. But it's found a real kind of resurgence of respect for the banjo, and people going, wow, I really love the banjo and what it can do and what it can add, and also how much joy it can bring people in a way, and also how accessible it can be. It's an instrument that, because it's typically tuned to an open chord, right away you can start making music with it. You don't have to learn how to get your fingers in a certain position to make a good sounding chord. You can just strum away on it and you're playing a chord. So it's very accessible in a lot of ways. And I think people are starting to realize that, remember that. And it's kind of made this boom of new players, which is really great to see.
Yeah. I think a lot of the bad rep that banjo got was kind of that it's super duper loud, like a bluegrass banjo in the wrong hands, like they just dominate, like it's
And they typically are a little tricky to tune too.
tune, yeah. And it's like, like they're like very attractive to people with like attention seeking behavior disorders for whatever reason. So you get a lot of like, people that are really looking to get flashy on them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I can definitely see that for sure. And that still exists in a big way. Yeah, yeah. A little, not
You're
to
not looking,
discredit what's
not
going on, but
looking.
yeah,
I'm playing banjo. You're not looking.
yeah,
So cool. Yeah, so that's like a State of the Union address for the world of banjos right there.
yeah.
Awesome. I'm glad it's growing. Like, and I'm especially glad that the open back stuff is growing. Like that that world is pretty cool. Like
Yeah, and like I was saying, it's really cool to see people doing new things with it, taking these old styles or sometimes not even using claw hammer or, developing their own way to play it and putting it into new genres and new
drop
soundscapes.
drop a name. If I wanted to hear some innovative open back banjo, where am I going? Besides you, of course.
Yeah, well, actually, the duo that I have that Trevor mentioned before we started, Carling and Will, we do a lot of mix of. My friend Carling is the primary banjo player in it, and I play primarily electric guitar with a lot of stuff. We've been starting to incorporate some pedal steel and kind of bridging the modern and the old in a fun way with our original stuff. Yeah, let me think of who would come to mind. So as far as like somebody who immediately comes to mind who's a really amazing person that bridges that kind of singer-songwriter modern songwriting style with clawhammer banjo is this guy Taylor Ashton. Who has a really unique kind of sound of like using this traditional style, but it's a modern sound as far as his songs go. And there's a number of people doing that. My friend Rachel Bayman is another one who uses that a lot. She plays a lot of clawhammer banjo in her songs, but has a very modern style of writing within her music. And it's, Americana music, you could call it, is probably the best way to categorize it. But a lot of people kind of going in that direction. And then I've definitely noticed more and more people not getting scared to mix it into any genre. And I can't come up with any names that are really out of the box right now. But it's out there and it's fun to see.
Yeah. If it occurs to you, we'll throw this video up later and we'll put some links up if they occur.
Yeah, definitely.
So should we do a tour and start looking at how banjos are made?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hopefully I can figure out the best way to do that. I was able to figure out a little bit of a tripod situation that might work.
Cool. Do you want to start at raw lumber and work our way through chronologically, or how does it make sense?
Whatever you want to do. Yeah, whatever you think makes sense. I actually luckily have some in a couple of different states right now. So here's how, and like any builder, everybody has their own process and different way they approach things. I typically start with roughly a 2 3/4 by 3 or 3 by 3 block that I'll usually laminate. And then, so my process, one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is a hybrid process of a lot of handwork and a lot of CNC work. And I use the CNC primarily as a parts maker, but it does a lot of the process on the neck until it gets basically to a glued up neck. Here's one. Let's see. So Let me see if I have a fingerboard around. It's a little rushed today. I had a rehearsal before this, so I think so basically I'll start with the neck blank, and I'll usually start the necks before I pull a rim, which I usually will do rims in large batches. So I'll cut a bunch of, I actually have a bunch of laminates here behind me. So this is how a rim layer starts. I do 3-ply rims, and I'll cut. I'm one of the few people that cuts the scarf joint, which is where the rim meets, ahead of time. And then I'll bend this with the scarf joint already cut to size. So I'll start with a huge pile of these. I'll soak them and I'll steam them. And
how are you steaming them? Are you using a steam tube or?
Yeah, I use over the years I've used just PVC tubes. Plugged on one end with an open end I can pull open. And I recently just built a new one, but it was during the supply shortage, and I was planning on making a big steam box and everything, but stuff's so hard to get that I just ended up getting some new PVC tubes and linking them together. And that's to come once I can start getting better sheet goods and stuff again. And so I'll steam them, and those actually work really well because I can stack up a lot of plies in a really small area, so I don't need to fill a huge steam box. And so use a big old pressure cooker and a propane on a little propane thing for steam.
So you're heating a pressure cooker with a propane like a propane like Bunsen burner kind of thing?
Yeah, totally. Like I think it's like a Bayou Buddy or something, made for big boil, cooking your crawfish kind of thing.
Okay. Cooking your crawfish. Now I've got
and over the years I've tried like self-contained steamers for wood steaming and stuff, but they all burn out with the amount that I use them. So I keep going back to that big propane setup.
The old like fabric,
and there's a company that makes like one of their little self-contained wood steamers and stuff, and they last about a year, and then they just fry and you can't replace anything. So
is there a temperature you're going for, or is steam
yeah, steam is 212 degrees. So it really, ideally you want that chamber as hot as possible. And one of the other keys I do, because I use a lot of figured wood, I don't know if you can see it, but it's pretty figured curly maple. One of the things I've found that is a big part of bending thicker plies, unlike guitar sides, and I have built a number of guitars and I have a whole setup to do so, but banjos really take over, is soaking the wood beforehand. And with guitar sides, you kind of spritz it down with some wood, which helps. But with thicker plies, I soak them sometimes overnight, because primarily I'm using all kiln dried wood, which is really hard to bend. It really likes to blow up.
Yeah.
And ideally I'd be using air dried wood for that, but it's hard to get really nice wood that's air dried consistently. And
any idea what part of the kiln drying process makes it difficult?
I think it has something to do with the cell structure, how it like completely dries everything out. It's something to do. I'm not sure on the exact science of it, but I think it has something to do with how the fiber of the wood links and holds together, and something in the kiln drying process kind of breaks that in a way. And I've never read into it really deeply, but that's kind of how it's always been explained to me, is that the kiln drying process gets it so dry that it never would really come back the same way that air dried wood does. But I've figured out a really good system for bending pretty much any piece of kiln dried wood. Mahogany is the only one that does some funny things, where it actually kind of compresses and crushes instead of bending completely. And it's just something I know how to work around and just kind of deal with. And sometimes you see it a little bit, it looks a little crinkled in the wood, but it doesn't affect anything structurally. It's really just an aesthetic thing on the inside of rims sometimes.
Is your steam setup kicking around there that we could look at, or would it be?
It's actually, no, that's one thing that's packed away in the basement, unfortunately. But it's essentially, I can probably dig up a picture of it. It's essentially two PVC pipes linked together with a tube with some dowels running through the side of it to support 4 rim layers kind of stacked up in there. I do have, it's unfortunately, should I try switching to my phone? I can go to the other side of the shop. It's unfortunately behind a big antique that my father's repairing right now, but I have, so after I steam, one of the, actually you can see it on my Instagram page. I have a good video of it, and I can probably find a picture, or I could probably share my screen and do a
screen. If you look down at the bottom there, there's a green thing that says share.
Oh, yep. Cool. So let me find, I have a video of what I do. So after I steam the plies, when I pull them out, I have, this is part of one of my new setups I just did. I'm a little underprepared for photos, but I have it right here somewhere.
Just to reiterate, so soak overnight and then.
Yep. So I usually soak at least, a few hours, 3 or 4 hours soaking, or overnight ideally. And then I pull them out and I throw them in the steamer for, depending on the kind of wood, the thickness I'm bending. Typically I'm bending just under a 1/4 inch, around 20 thousandths or so. Or two, yeah, like 2.22 is where I start. And there's a reason for that I'll get into later too, is so then I'll pull them out, I'll steam them for about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on thicknesses. And then I have one of the lathes I have in the wood shop, our wood lathe. It doesn't get a lot of use these days. My father doesn't use it for furniture, and I stopped using it for banjos a long time ago. Its primary use for me now is bending rim layers, and it doesn't get turned on. I just use essentially the lathe to, okay, here we go. Here's a good, let's see, it's got to load real quick. I'm essentially just using the lathe head with a jig that I've made to bend the rims for me. I used to use just a round caul that was screwed down to one of my benches, and I just have a big strap, and I just walk around pulling this strap to bend this ply around the circle. And I just recently switched to this setup.
Well, if you're having a hard time getting it to play, you can.
I think I've got it.
You can send it to me, and I can play it too.
Oh, I just gotta. I was hoping to do all this morning, but a band rehearsal got moved this morning.
Right,
so.
You can also just send it to me, and I'll.
I think I've got it. I just gotta give it permission to take my screen. Oh yeah, I think it will. I think it's gonna make me quit. I'll send it to you.
Okay. Actually, I'm on my iMac too, so I've been having problems with Apple permissions lately.
Yeah. Well, I can explain it pretty well for now. Okay. Essentially, it's just a round, instead of like a chuck on my wood lathe, I just have a piece of plywood mounted to a faceplate with a big spring steel strap coming off, kind of like what you would to bend a guitar side. And underneath that is a pneumatic bearing that I have. So it's just a pneumatic piston that just goes in and out, that I have a big bearing mounted to that pushes up into that form. And I just stick the ply in, and I turn the lathe manually with a big hand wheel on the outboard part, and it just spins the piece right around the jig. And then I pull it right out and put it into a drying form while it's still flexible and malleable. And then I have just round drying forms, and I put those in a little homemade kiln that I have that's basically just a sealed box with a couple light bulbs in it that gets to around 100 degrees or so, a little more than that. And that kind of does the kind of the heat setting process of it, sets the bend, kind of like a guitar side sitting overnight and heating a secondary time. And then I'll take them, and then I laminate them. from there. And I do 3-plies primarily for most of my work. I do 3-ply rims, and that's part of the new system I mentioned that my friend Richard Newman helped me develop, where in the past I'd have an external form, a round external form with the diameter I needed in the center. And I can actually hear, sorry.
It's all right.
I'll switch to my phone for this, and I can go to the other side of the shop. Show you guys some of this. Will this work?
Yep.
Mobile? All right.
Ted, you want to pin the, there we go.
Yep.
If you want to flip the camera.
Yeah. Okay. So here's my rim laminate set. So you can see the external forms are there. And then behind it, in the back here, are these expanding calls. So these are all different calls I've made for the different rim layers, each size for particular layers. And they have these kerfs cut in them so they can expand and contract. And then the center is tapered to fit these big aluminum plugs that I've machined. So when I drive those plugs down in using the screw press, it just
oh no. Will, we lost you. Right at the, are you there, Will?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
Did my internet give out?
We had just a little bit of a technical difficulty, but I saw what you had going there. So
yeah, I can walk over and show the bending jig too. If it might, I think it's mounted still. Yeah.
So the plug drives at home, and that actually spreads your laminations out and into each other.
Yeah, exactly. So that's essentially so I used to take these forms and just put 30 C-clamps, big C-clamps around them with little calls.
Yeah.
And it's just a nightmare trying to do that. And
oh my God, yeah.
This system is just so fast. And the other one of the little bit of curveballs when you're doing that is those calls and those rim layers have to fit together perfectly. You're gonna get gaps. You're gonna get weird things out around and not fitting together. So in between each ply, these internal layers that are plywood, flip it over and I can show you. So they have I have a faceplate on my big metal lathe, which is where I turn my rims. These calls come out and mount really accurately onto my metal lathe, and I turn a little skim coat I just take a few thousandths off the inside, enough to clean up that scarf joint I mentioned, and make that next layer fit perfectly in that next one. So in between each ply, I'm actually putting them on the lathe and lightly turning them. So it's
how close to Gibson like manufacturing of rims that is? That seems very
it's probably a little farther than they went, honestly. Yeah. So it's a little trapped behind here, but there's that form that I mentioned with the hydraulic bearing. And then I just, turn it by hand with this big external wheel. And it's increased the speed of my steam bending process exponentially.
How satisfying was that when you first got that going? I bet that
so much so. So much so. It definitely was a big moment for sure. So I'll switch back to this setup here.
That plug, pressing your lamps together with that plug, I mean, that's pretty slick. That's really, really, really nice.
Yeah, and that was what I mentioned, that the one time I've really let somebody show me how to do something the way they did it, and said, I need to do it this way. When I saw how my friend Richard did it and he shared it, he's like, I'm happy to help you get set up like this and show you how to do all this and how I do it. And he developed it, as I mentioned. What was that?
I was just gonna ask if you had to like mow his lawn for a couple months.
I mean, he's been a really gracious, generous friend, and he's he's 75 years old, and he's like, all this knowledge is going to die with me, and he's like, I want to pass it to somebody who I trust to do it right. And so he's been really generous in that way. And
well, if you pick one thing not to be a self-proctoring Mensa exam administrator, this was, I think, the one. Like,
yeah, and so he developed it out of a need to make rims, as many rims as possible, as fast as possible, because he's actually the guy that supplies some larger makers with rims. He makes all of Banjos rims, for instance. And when somebody orders a few hundred rims from you, you really start thinking about that process. And that's one of the things that you've probably noticed about my work, is that in developing all these things that I do, it's, in a way, I've set myself up to be a production shop, but I never want to be in full production. I always want to maintain a smaller scale and do it myself with the help of one or two employees, or just myself and one person, or just myself if I need to. And I don't ever want to feel like I want to compete or need to compete on a higher level, but I also want the precision and the consistency and the ease of doing it in a production like setting. But also the flexibility to do things in a custom way or a different way every time if I want, and that's one of the things I've kind of been working towards in a big way.
You're living in the right point of time to approach things that way. It wasn't always easy to do that.
Yeah. And I feel really fortunate too, to have what I have with what my father has built, and with having this shop and the metal shop and having this creative family I'm surrounded with. And it's really kind of a family, we call it the family compound. It's like, and my cousin is here working for my father, making furniture with him, and the little bit that he's still going, but we're all just doing our own thing in the same space around each other and supporting each other, and in a beautiful place. And it's a really special kind of thing that it's not always easy to be here and doing what I'm doing, but I look around and I say, what else would I be doing? And this is so unique and amazing that I get to do this in this way.
So, yeah, you did allude a little bit to CNC stuff and the flexibility, and kind of the world of rapid prototyping now is like, it's nuts. It seems like you've embraced that.
Yeah. And so that's something that, along with the amazing wood shop, my father luckily got into at a certain point for his business, making furniture. He realized he had a close friend of ours who's a sign maker just 10 minutes down the road. My father started hitting him up as soon as he realized he had a CNC and he could hit him up to get CNC work done. He started going over to the shop all the time, say, hey, can you cut these inlays for me? Can you cut these parts for me? And he very quickly realized how valuable it would be for his business. And he's never been the strongest with technology, but he knew he'd have a guy that could do it, or he'd figure it out if he had to. And so he bought a CNC probably 14 years ago now, before I started my business, before I started working for him full time.
How old was he when he decided to make that plunge?
Probably like 60, so pretty later adaptable in his career. Yeah, he's a very adaptable guy, and not afraid to make that plunge, knowing that it was really valuable for his business. And at the time he was getting a lot of really big high-end work and really saw the value in it very quickly early on. So it took me a number, when I first started my business, I was still just barely learning how to run the CNC. And I've always been really good at technology and computers and figuring that kind of stuff out. It's just how my brain works. But it took me a while to get my head around, how to approach it, and really it took me until I started teaching somebody else how to do it, to really wrap my head around, I can really do anything I
What
want
program?
with this.
Just out of curiosity, what programs are you using?
I'm using Rhino and Rhino Cam primarily, and I've used a couple of others, mainly CAD programs, but and Cam software over the years, but that's the one that has given me the ability to do anything I want to do, really. And so stepping back a number of years, probably 6 or 7 years ago, my friend Adam Buchwald of Circle Strings and Iris Guitars and Allied Luthery now, he was just starting to build Circle Strings, that brand. It was early on in that venture. And he hit me up and he said, "Hey, I need to implement a CNC in my work. I need help. You're not far away." He's just 2 hours north of me in Burlington. And I went up 2 days a week and I taught him how to run a CNC and was helping him out in his shop while I was teaching him how to do that. And that's what really reminded me how powerful those machines are. And I was doing a lot with it at the time. I was cutting my fingerboards. I was doing some rough neck shaping. I was doing a lot with it at that time. But that's actually what led me into the Rhino world and getting into the 3D modeling and the 3D CAD. And that's really what stepped up my game, is kind of, it pushed me to the next level in a big way.
Mostly like kind of what they call 2.5D stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's really what kind of pushed me into that next level of really realizing I can do anything I can draw, I can figure out how to program and cut. And I'm still using that same CNC that my father bought 14 years ago. And it's a little temperamental sometimes, but it was a high-end machine. It was a low-end, high-end machine. It was a really low-end model for multicam. So it was not an entry-level machine by any means. And it's a full 4x8 large bed machine that I've since done some modification to here and there and figured out ways around having it accessible and usable for his business, but also in my world of using vacuum hold downs and fixtures and jigs, having all those things removable and movable. And, it's a really interesting system that I've developed because it's not dedicated to my business. So I've always had to kind of work around having it accessible to other people, but it's led to some really interesting innovations that I've found that have been really kind of instrumental. And I don't know what I would do without having that kind of flexibility.
Are you doing, I'm probably not thinking about this right, but how many axes are you using on your machine now? Are you 3-axis or 4?
Yeah, it's a 3-axis. And that's one of the limitations I have, is I don't have a 4th or a 5th axis like some people have. And that's something that I've been thinking about in the next 5 years or so, is upgrading that machine to something that would be at least a 4-axis machine.
I mean, when I think about like fitting a neck to a rim, like is 4th axis required, or can you do that with 3-axis?
So that's actually something that along with that flexibility of having things come on and off the machine, it got me thinking in that 4th axis in a way of creating my own 4th axis. So one of the way that I do my neck sets, so this is kind of how, after so to kind of step back a little bit, after my neck block, I'll cut my fingerboard out on the CNC, do all the fret slotting, all the inlays, do the peg heads, do all the truss rod slot, get all the location pins for anywhere that I want them for fingerboard mainly, rough it out on the bandsaw, and then I'll do a rough shaping on the CNC. If it's not a fully custom one of a kind one, then it just makes sense to hand shape, which I still do a decent amount of hand shaping. And there's still a lot of hand shaping to go in this one, as you can see. I don't go too crazy with getting the programming perfectly precise, because I'm so fast, and I do some certain details usually that's just not possible with my machine. And then the next part is the neck set. So fitting to the rim, getting that curve and getting that angle. I have a jig that I built on my CNC to give me that kind of swing that holds the neck from the fingerboard plane. And I can run upstairs in a second. It's actually on the machine right now. That will give me, through my CAD drawing that I have all these banjos designed in, I can figure out that trigonometry to get that neck angle figured out, and that projection over the head. And I have all of these neck angles figured out, and different, essentially it's just a swing jig that'll hold the neck like this and swing it up and down. And I just have different angled wedges that I cut on the machine to stick in there to get consistent angles every time. And then, I'll just set it there, and I know where the end of my neck is in my CAD programming, and the bit will just come in and cut that. And I don't know if you can probably see potentially the little witness lines of all the different cuts I make to get that angle.
Yeah.
Essentially. And that's going to the repair angle. That's one of the things that has allowed me to do extremely precise neck resets on banjos and really understand the geometry of a neck reset on a banjo, which is similar to a guitar neck reset in what you're trying to accomplish, obviously, but how you go about doing that on a set dowel neck banjo is just a nightmare, because everything's curved, everything's moving, there's no dovetail that you can just pop together and check things as easily. So you really kind of have to figure it out all with math, and then apply it in a real world and hope that math works out, which it sometimes does. And sometimes there's wiggle room that you have to work with. But having that jig allows me to take a finished banjo neck or an old antique banjo neck or a vintage banjo neck and put that on and recut the heel in a very accurate way.
Speaking of neck resets on banjos, are your banjos primarily dowel stick, or are you using rods? Or
so primarily for years they were all dowel stick. The first couple that I made were coordinator rods before I figured out the dowel stick, and really mostly I'd never really seen many banjos. So the ones I had seen had been coordinator rod banjos, and just up until the end of last year, all of my banjos were dowel stick banjos. And I just recently invented a new neck attachment hardware that I've been using that maintains the traditional look of a dowel stick. It still uses a dowel stick, but the dowel stick is now part of the rim, and the neck is bolted on using that hardware. And that's what the holes in the end of this are for. And it's something that there's a number of other open back makers have switched to bolt-on necks and use bolt-on necks, but the way they've essentially done it is using one wooden coordinator rod. The most typical method that you see is 2 hanger bolts in the neck, like a coordinator rod banjo would have, and then they just make a round dowel stick that screws onto that bottom bolt, and then just a nut on the top one. And I never wanted to switch to that method, because as somebody who repairs a lot of banjos, if you don't support that rim as much as you can, it's just going to do this. And they all do at certain points. But if you don't have support in the middle or the top of that rim, it's just going to want to move and just fold in half.
String tension is pulling it, just like
exactly.
It's trying to turn into a bow and arrow.
Exactly. And the I think one of the first people that I ever saw do that lowered wooden round coordinator rod was Jason Romero, who's a really highly regarded maker and a really amazing banjo maker. And it's been a huge influence and help to me over the years. And I got a banjo mandolin in a trade that he had made. It was one of the early banjo mandolins that he'd made. Somebody traded it to me for a banjo, and right away, when I got it, I said, "Oh, this thing needs a neck reset. It's just imploding on itself because of that low coordinator rod." And the enhanced tension was really the main thing that kind of that made it, a 5-string banjo would be able to mostly hold up if the rim is strong enough, but having that extra tension, it just made it an extreme force to just, turn that thing into an egg essentially. And that's what kind of led me to go, I don't think I want to use that method. I don't think there's enough support that it allows for. That's why Gibson uses 2 coordinator rods mainly. It's adjustability, but it's also for support in that top of the rim. You've got to keep that rim rigid. And I wanted to switch to a bolt-on neck because the set dowel stick banjos, while being a great joint when done correctly and really rigid and strong, there is zero adjustability. There's less and less understanding of that joint, how it works, how to reset it properly, how to maintain it, even among builders and players alike and repair guys. I've just seen, we've all seen the banjos with tons of holes in the back of the rim and people just move the dowel stick up and down. And
yeah. So do you pull dowel sticks when you do a neck reset, or?
Yeah, so it depends. When I'm doing a dowel stick neck reset, actually my preferred method is pretty extreme, and it kind of scares some people, but it's a method that I learned from a friend of mine, Andy Fitzgibbon in West Virginia, who works for Bob Smacula, who's a big name in the banjo world, who's restored countless amount of banjos. And I learned this method from him of actually cutting the dowel stick off at the neck and then rebuilding the tenon. And I don't do it for all of them, but essentially what you get into in the vintage banjo world, even in the high end of the early banjos, they're all over the place. Vega is the big name in those of the banjos that have held on the best, and the people want work done to the most usually are these old Vega banjos, old white ladies and tubaphones, and they were extremely consistent in how they made banjos, except for the way they set their necks and set their dowel sticks. Some dowel sticks are straight, the tenons are straight. Some of them, they end up in different places in the rims. The angles are all different. Essentially, there's no consistencies. You'll find similarities and like, oh, this one's like that one, but this one's not like this one, And when you steam those dowels out, sometimes you find a straight tenon off of the dowel stick, but sometimes you find one that the tenon, more likely you'll find that the tenon is actually angled to the rest of the plane of the dowel stick. So you end up with this extreme trigonometry problem that's kind of all like mystery numbers in this way. So usually the best way to do those kinds of neck resets are start with a fresh slate, essentially, like cut off the tenon, rebuild that tenon on the end of the dowel stick, plug the holes, and then start with a fresh tenon that is straight to a certain plane, and then drill that hole based off your fingerboard plane on whatever angle you need. And with banjos and the way rims warp and things move, there's always that weird gray area that we all run into at times with instruments and wood. But having that kind of understanding of where the math ends up and where things should be, and having control over those elements of like, this tenon's, somebody shaped it with a rasp on the end of this dowel stick. Who knows how round and straight this thing is? Not having that element in there makes for a much more accurate end result.
How crazy do the vintage banjo guys get about flopping a dowel stick off and retenoning it?
I've actually never run into somebody that really cared how the inside of it was done, as long as it looked right in the end and played the way they wanted it to. I'm sure there's some of my friends who are the really high-end collectors, they own banjos that have had this done to them, but generally those guys, they don't even reset the necks. They won't touch it unless it has to be, or unless it's going to be their player banjo. So it really depends, and sometimes it's just necessary because it's, if you want to play it, if you want to keep it alive, this kind of stuff has to be done. And in the banjo world, a lot of, like, for instance, a lot of those Vega banjos, there's a fair number of them that don't have original fingerboards, don't have original pegheads, because they used a lot of pressure dyed wood that just turns to dust, as you know. I know you've seen a lot of that.
Repair wood, what up?
Yeah, the stuff that you just can't save. You know, you can try, but it'll just fall apart completely. And I work with a number of collectors, but the ones that I do tend to not be too picky about that kind of stuff, because they're also players and they want to play the instruments and they want them to stay alive in a way that people will play them and enjoy them.
Cool. We got sidetracked from building banjos, and
yeah, as will happen. Yeah.
Where were we at? We were next.
Yeah, so the next set in the neck attachment hardware, essentially, I think is where we left off. So I actually have a couple I just finished up with that neck attachment hardware that I mentioned. So essentially what I did when I developed that new piece of hardware, I wanted to switch to a bolt-on neck for the ease of future neck resets, neck adjustments, even just taking the neck off if you ever wanted to. But I didn't want to sacrifice the integrity of the rim that dowel stick gives you by giving you a little bit more rigidity and support in the center of the rim. But one of the things I also realized is cutting a big square hole in the side of the rim, you're losing a lot of wood in a really important part of the rim. And being a circle made out of wood, even laminated, they're really strong, they're flexible, you know, they move. And when you cut a big chunk out of it for that dowel stick to pass through, you're losing a lot of structural integrity in a very important part. And on top of that, the traditional neck attachment hardware for a dowel stick banjo is the one that I believe Fairbanks and Vega developed, which is that little U yoke that fits over the thing with the hole through the pin through the dowel stick and the screw. And I looked at it one day and I said, this is putting pressure in all the wrong spots. It's pushing the neck up and forward, you know, at the bottom of the heel. That screw pushes on the bottom of the heel, which is putting pressure the opposite way you'd want. It's pulling back on the top, but it's not supporting the top of the rim at all. There's zero support above that dowel stick, above where that square hole is. There's just no support there, which is where a lot of the string tension lands. And I said, yeah, that doesn't make sense. And this hardware it doesn't really work for me. Aesthetically, it's not great either. And it got me to thinking, and I developed this cantilevered solid piece of hardware with no moving parts, essentially, that interrupts the dowel stick and the neck. So the dowel stick is still in the rim. I'll pull out one of these banjos and I can show you. So the dowel stick's still in the rim, and the hanger bolts pass through the rim and through the hardware. I don't know if hopefully you can see that. Is it too dark?
It's a little dark.
It's a little dark. Here, I'll switch to my phone and I can show you guys. That'll probably be the easiest way. Will that work?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that's the piece of hardware that I invented. So essentially it looks exactly like a traditional dowel stick banjo. But this dowel stick, once it's installed, it never has to leave the rim again.
And that I'm guessing you have a threaded rod coming from the neck, and that nut is capturing that.
Yeah, so essentially how it works, the dowel stick in each end has threaded inserts that I put in each end that, you know, the end bolt for the tailpiece will get screwed into the threaded insert in this way. So it's all mechanical. There's no wood screws involved in it. So there's a threaded insert in both ends, and there's a hidden bolt under the heel that goes into it this way. So it kind of traps the dowel stick and locks that into the rim. And then the bolts coming through, which these are the nuts for the hanger bolt. There's one on each end. There's two on there. And that's these nuts here are what are attaching the neck. And then there's another hidden one that comes in from the opposite side of the rim that's attaching the dowel stick along with the end bolt here.
That is beautiful, by the way. Your finish work on that is really stellar.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This is one I just finished up the other day. Cool. That's kind of a standard model of mine these days with some of the pearl engraving work that I do.
That's coming along. How's that truss rod cover captured?
Yeah, so this is kind of fun too. I'm all about doing new innovations on my banjos lately, and this is one that a friend of mine kind of suggested. He's like, I want truss rods, but I don't want to have it screwed on. It's a magnetic cover, so it just pops up and slides right off, and then truss rod underneath, and it just pops right back into place.
Is it grabbing the nut as its magnetic point, or
no, there's three little magnets. You can probably see them under under the finish there. Yeah, and then then matching there. And I've thought about playing around with different designs and shapes and sizing it down, but this has been working out really nicely lately. Gives you plenty of room to work around and adjust things, and it also gives me a lot of room if I want to put an inlay on it too, which has been kind of fun.
What tuners are you rolling with there?
These are the classic Goto planetary tuners, but I use a lot of the new Rickard Cyclone tuners as well, which a lot of people like. Yeah, they're amazing. That's probably the best innovation that's hit the banjo world in a long time.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
More than the Keith tuner.
I love the Keith tuner. I mean, those as far as like the quality of a tuner goes, you cannot beat the Keith tuner. But they tend to be a little pricey for some people, and the locking Scruggs style tuners that they make are so cool, but not everybody is able to utilize them. You don't
hear that much anymore, as it turns out.
Yeah, it's definitely less common. I know I have a few friends that are really good at it, but they're hard because
chimes or something, or
yeah, exactly. But they're hard because you can only utilize them on open strings because you can't play and use them at the same time. Mm-hmm. You have to have that free hand to turn them with. So they're kind of limited in that way. Mm-hmm. Being a pedal steel player,
had one on his telly, but
yeah, totally.
Okay, so that is one cool neck attachment.
Yeah, so I just recently switched to that back in November. I think was the first prototype, and I've just started to put it on all the banjos that I make these days, unless somebody requests for the traditional set. But I haven't really had anybody do that. Other than I do make a lot of conversion necks. There's a neck that I have going for an old Vega banjo, and that'll be a set dowel, of course, to fit with the old rim. So next set. So then it's just a lot of work we all know of just fretting and final shaping and sanding and the deeper I get into the metalworking part, the more I make. And I'm kind of setting out to make every single part of the banjo except for the tuners and the fret wire is pretty much my goal at the end of the day. And I'm almost there. I'm getting fairly close.
Did I see you you were making tone rings now, or?
I make some tone. So I've made some tone rings for a long time. The first one was just a rolled brass ring, essentially. And those are pretty easy. That's just rolling a piece of brass and brazing it together at the right size. But I have recently gotten into making, my friend Kevin Enoch, for instance, there's a little bit of a problem in the banjo world. There's only a couple of people that make hardware you can buy. There's Rickard up in Canada. Stu Mac makes a little bit still with the 5-star stuff in Stu Mac, but they're making less and less. and Pisgah, Balsam Banjo Works, which is Pisgah Banjos, my friend Patrick in North Carolina. And my friend Brooks Maston in Portland makes some hardware and offers it for sale sometimes, mainly just hooks and nuts. But that's pretty much it. There's really nowhere to get, like, if you want to get banjo hardware, that's who you go to. There's a couple other makers that bridge more of the bluegrass world. Pruka in the Czech Republic, they're still making a lot of stuff, but it's heavily geared towards the bluegrass world. So if you're an open back maker, you don't have a lot of options other than Rickard and Balsam Banjo Works. So when they're not making something or something's not available, you're kind of, you're dead in the water, essentially. And one of the things that has been less commonly made these days is tubaphone tone rings. So my friend Kevin Enoch called me up one day and says, "Hey, I need a tubaphone tone ring and I cannot get one." So we realized that Rickard up in Canada, still making their little Wonder tone ring, which is a spun sleeve with the rolled brass ring spun around it. And then his tubaphones were essentially that plus the hollow square tube with the holes drilled on the inside added to it. And I said, "I've been thinking about doing this for a while. Let me figure it out." So I started scratching my head and came up with a method for making that tube, essentially. And it's really no different than rolling other brass. I just needed new dies for my ring roller and a good setup to drill all these holes inside after it was all rolled and put together, essentially. And as I've mentioned, that's one of those things I go, I like a good problem, and I like figuring out something that nobody really knows how to do, and it's kind of a sense of pride of me of going like, yeah, I know how to do that. I know nobody else does it because it's a pain in the ass or nobody wants to do it, but it's necessary for my work. And it's it's an amazing feeling being able to kind of crack something like that, not primarily being a metal worker originally. And I've definitely become more of one. And along with that, one of the metal lathes I have is a spinning lathe, which is yet another lost art that's used a lot in the banjo world of metal spinning. One of the most popular tone rings these days is the Dobson tone ring, which is that kind of donut tone ring. Really popularized by guys like Adam Hurt, for instance, who's a pretty well-known clawhammer player who plays a Dobson. And that's a spun piece of hardware, essentially. And I haven't quite cracked all of those yet. I've done some spinning for a really crazy Del Vecchio resonator copy I made for a guitar years ago. Did you ever see photos of that one? That's a pretty out-of-the-box project for me that I did years ago.
I remember seeing that resonator. I didn't. Maybe was it multiple? Was it multiple pictures? Maybe I didn't scroll past.
It could have been, yeah. So it was a custom project for a friend of mine who owns an original Del Vecchio resonator that he wanted one built for steel strings because none of them were. And his is, he plays it with a slide, but the neck is like a bow and arrow, essentially. And he wanted something that he could play like a guitar. And I essentially took his original and remade everything. And it took having to hand spin this really complicated kind of resonator support that popped into the wooden top and then had the wooden cover plate and everything. And it led me to find an old spinning lathe. And it's one of those, yet another problem I don't need to solve. I kind of felt like I had to.
Yeah. So you could make resonators too now, correct? Or
yeah, I could. Yeah, I haven't. That was years ago that I have, and I've thought about making a couple more of them, and I've had requests to. But such a niche market for those Del Vecchio style resonators. But I could make the one thing I didn't spin on that was the cones because I was so deep into spinning the support that I said I think I hit up Paul McGill, if I got the name right, who's made a number of those Del Vecchio style guitars. And he's like, yeah, I've got a batch to spin. I'll spin you a batch of those cones because the cones are just different enough that you can't use a traditional biscuit cone for them. But yeah, going back to the banjo tone rings, it's something that I'm gearing up to make more and more of those once I can once I can set up my spinning lathe to do more spinning, because a lot of them have spun parts involved. The more complicated ones do, at least.
Can you talk a little bit about what the difference between a spinning lathe and maybe something that you would use for your rims would be?
Yeah. So what I use for for making, like, turning my rims, for instance, or making a tension hoop, for instance, which I primarily use grooved tension hoops. So it's bent in a circle, and then I machine this groove into the side on the lathe. So basically an engine lathe is what would be referred to, a tool room lathe or an engine lathe. And a spinning lathe it's more similar to a wood lathe, actually. And a lot of the one that I got, for instance, it came from the Dartmouth wood shop, and they had been using it as a bowl turning lathe because they traditionally have a really deep throat, like, 15, 16 inches. So if you want to turn a big bowl, it worked great for that. And a lot of wood, in the days before a lot of bowl turning lathes specifically started being produced, that's what a lot of people went to, is these early spinning lathes. So it's essentially very similar to a wood lathe, usually a very high powered wood lathe, 1 to 3 to 5 horsepower. But it's the tool rest is where the difference comes in. It's the tool rest it looks like a wood turning lathe tool rest for your chisels, but instead of being just a flat, smooth surface, it's flat, and it has all these holes drilled in it for pins to go in to leverage a tool against. So essentially you're pinning a thin piece of sheet metal in between your form that's mounted on your chuck and your end stock, and you're manipulating that metal around that form, usually a wooden form or a metal form, to kind of recreate a part. So you're forming the metal and not cutting the metal, essentially. And you're using these big long tools with a polished end and using your body weight, leveraging them against, and sometimes there's big scissor tools to get more leverage and stuff. It's a really fascinating, if you want a rabbit hole to go down, look up metal spinning on YouTube, and it's just days of entertainment. It's crazy.
Well, it sounds dangerous as all get out, too.
It's definitely dangerous, for sure. I mean, I shredded a lot of metal learning how to do some of it,
Yeah.
and I'm getting ready to do some more of that in the future. And you create a lot of really fast spinning razor like objects, for sure.
That's what I just imagine that, like, your ceiling is just chock full of like little darts,
Yeah.
like slag coming off of there.
Yeah.
Connor, unmute and ask your question really quick. I feel like I'm gonna butcher your question if I do it.
Mute. Hey, William. I was just wondering, I have an ambition to kind of build a banjo, and thinking about a lathe. What would you recommend for somebody who mightn't want to go as big as you? Can you get away with a wood lathe, or is it just silly and you need a machinist lathe to turn a rim?
Oh, 100% you can get away with a wood lathe. I started on a wood lathe. I didn't get a good metal lathe until probably 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm about 14 years in or so, I think. I don't even know exactly. So a lot of banjo makers actually do use wood lathes, or just a wood lathe head. And the trick is, the first handful of banjo rims I did hand turn, and that's kind of a nightmare. Turning the inside of a banjo rim by hand is no fun.
Yeah.
And the trick is you get a small cross slide that, an X and a Y, small little cross slide that you can bolt to the ways of a wood lathe. And then you can mount, different tools to that, and essentially kind of use it like a metal lathe, but it's a wood lathe. And you just have to kind of figure out, if you have a lathe now, or if you want to set one up, you just have to figure out that that all the pieces will kind of play nice together. And there's always some fabrication that goes into that. But I even still have my old setup that I use, that cross slide that I used. I still use it for other uses, but I turned a lot of rims that way. And the nice thing, one of the tricky parts about metal lathes and turning wood on them is a lot of metal lathes don't go very fast. You know, they're going 800 RPM or 1200 RPM. And the one that I have is a big 15-inch LeBlanc gearhead that is designed to go very fast. And I think the fast speed on mine is like 2800 or something like that. And with a large diameter, that's pretty fast. So you have to kind of, the wood lathe is really great for it because it spins fast enough where you can get a really nice cut on wood. So that's why a lot of banjo makers use wood lathes, primarily with those cross slide setups.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
You were pretty much only bringing the metal lathe in for when you were trying to true up your laminates for your laminated rims, correct?
Well, okay, yeah. So that's also where I left off. So after I do that laminating process, I end up with this. Essentially, this is one of my rim blanks after it comes out. So it's pretty rough. You know, it's got a rough top. You can see the scarf joint on the outside and on the inside. So this is essentially an oversized rough rim. Well, I know exactly how much. It's a 16th oversized on the inside and the outside. And I have pretty tight tolerances that I work with because I'm a crazy person. But also because of the accuracy of my setup, I know I don't need a lot of wiggle room. So then I will take this rim blank, and then I have chucks that I've cut on my lathe that hold it from the inside and the outside. So then I will then go back in and turn this rim on that same lathe with just a different setup. And I can true everything up and then add things to it and true it up, or do, ledges for tone rings to fit or bracket bands to get on and all that kind of stuff. So after the laminating process where I am turning each ply, I'll then take this after I dry it and put it back on the lathe and turn it again. So there's a lot of machining that goes into a rim. But once you have the setup done the way I do it, it's very quick. You know, I can get from this to a finished rim in just a few hours, really. And really just probably an hour or two at the most, even with all the holes and everything, even for the more complicated setups.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So let's see here. What are you doing for finish?
I've bounced around a lot on that. I started out using what a lot of amateur banjo makers use, which is True Oil, which is a nightmare. It's a great finish. I mean, it's a beautiful finish when you get it right. And I've lately, my primary finish is Cardinal nitrocellulose, and I finish with a satin top coat. And it's just, I love a nice satin finish. I'm not a huge fan of high gloss finishes. They have their place, and when they're done right, they look great. And I do them sometimes for some conversion necks, a bluegrass neck or an old Vega neck that needs to match something, but primarily I want it to feel nice and look nice, and not try to, I'm not a big fan of big shiny flashy finishes. I like kind of the muted, understated, shows the wood off more than the finish. And I typically do a very thin finish. I'm doing at the most usually 5 coats of lacquer, and that's with sanding too. So it's a very thin finish. It's a little more delicate than you might find in a modern finish, but it's one of those things that I just have always I've played around a lot, and it's what I've been really happy with that. Just enough finish to seal it and protect it, but not enough where it feels thick or looks thick. And one of the things I don't do anymore is pour fill, which some people are really, again, it got to be pour filled. Walnut's got to be pour filled. Mahogany's got to be pour filled. But with a thin finish, you can get away with not filling the pores, and it really looks like real wood still. And that's something that I really, being a woodworker first and a furniture maker first, it's an aesthetic that I really like, in a way of not trying to make wood something that it's not.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what it is about True Oil, but I use it in some homemade pour filler recipes, and that stuff is of all the stuff I've had my nose around, like that stuff gives me such a bad headache. I don't know why.
Yeah, there's some really nasty stuff in there, and I know they can't even sell it in some states because of that now.
Yeah.
It's harder to find, I think, now too, because it's a really nasty finish. And I got deep into that, so deep into that I was spraying it and figured out how to spray it. I was spraying water locks for a while. I was trying to get these really, really micro thin finishes perfect. And I said, no, I'm going back to lacquer. And I've played around with some waterborne lacquers that I found that I like. And I use one still. I think the one I've been using lately is from Target Finishes, the M-Tech. It's a luthier base. I think they're out of Connecticut or Rhode Island or Massachusetts or something. But it's a great finish. But the waterborne, they just always have that gray bluish tint to them that your eye catches, or certain colors of woods or stains just really doesn't look right.
Yeah.
And there's no ambering quality to it. There's no, and the durability is also definitely less as well. So I just kind of, I went with that for a year or two, and then I have just landed right back on the Cardinal lacquer, and it's just,
yeah, they're doing pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I like them.
Cardinal.
Yeah. And I've thought about playing around with some other ones, because it's not my favorite thing to sand, that's for sure. But yeah, I think I'm going to stick with traditional nitro in the future, long term, though.
What is your issue with sanding Cardinal?
Just it's just
yeah,
it just balls up. Yeah, it loves to ball up. It's one of the things. And I don't, luckily I don't have to do a lot of sanding, like, a guitar body or something. But the problem with banjos, when I make a guitar, it's great because I can pull out the power sanders and, sand the back and the sides and but with a banjo, everything's curved. There's no flat surfaces. So you're sanding on curves everywhere. So it's so easy to burn through when you're using power sanding. And it's so basically I'm stuck hand sanding everything. So that's the only thing that I'd say with my finishing process that I kind of dread a little bit, is doing the level sanding part. But it's really not bad. I put on some good music or listen to a good audiobook or podcast and sit outside my spray booth and sand away.
Yeah, it's yeah.
It can be a really meditative part of the process in a way.
I don't mind it. My time in the finish department, I was never like in there 100% of the time, so I didn't really get the full experience.
Yeah.
But I always kind of liked it, like.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing, is like I was saying, I'm not a production shop, so I'm not sanding all day. I'm not doing one thing all the time. I get to do a little bit of everything all the time. And with my schedule lately, I'm sanding 3 or 4 banjos every month or month and a half, every 2 months, depending on my schedule and the repair schedule and stuff. So it's just part of the process. And I kind of love all of it. There's not one part that I dread or hate doing, or there's just, as you've probably noticed with how I do things, I'm always trying to improve on what I'm doing and how I'm doing things. And it's one of the steps where I go, this could be better or easier or done in a different way, possibly, but maybe not. And I'm totally cool with accepting that at times when it's not. And you kind of have to know where that balance lives of, it is what it is.
Have you ever gone down a road of innovation to find a dead end? And like, how do you have any tips for knowing when you've actually
when to stop
it, rather than just gotten somewhere and gotten fussy about it and to give up?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any great tips, because I keep going down that road for sure. But there's definitely, my father's really good at kind of accepting things for what they are, in a way, and not trying to force things to be what they're not, or not trying to, make things too perfect. And he's been a really good reminder of that. And, he looks at what I do, and I've taken the fine furniture world that he brought me into and taught me to another level with, I'm working with 1,007 inch, and he's like, you're crazy. I don't even, what are you doing? I don't even understand what you're doing half the time, but keep doing it. Mm-hmm. But then he'll be a really good reminder of, take a step back is it accomplishing what you want it to accomplish? Are you getting it done in a relatively quick way? And are you happy doing it? And it's there in the world of the banjo, there's a lot of lost techniques and a lot of lost art in a lot of ways, because a lot of the banjo makers of the past that kind of pioneered a lot of this hardware and techniques and styles of building these things, it was all lost at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to recreate that stuff, some of it is possible, and some of it you're just going to beat your head against the wall forever. And it was probably done in a completely opposite way so quickly and easily that we just don't have the means to really recreate in our modern world sometimes. That I don't give up easily, but there's definitely times where I've put some things aside and said that's for a future, extra couple weeks or something.
There's something about teens mandolins. I don't know if you've ever worked on any Gibsons from the teens, but you pop the fingerboards off of there and their dovetails are so incredibly tight. And you wonder, like, that's back when they had like horse-drawn routers or some, the one pulley going through the entire shop to drive these machines.
All these belts, yeah.
And like, I've never seen a modern manufacturer like tackle that F5 or F4 neck joint and come up with anything that doesn't require just a ton of handwork to it. And these don't look like they had any handwork to them, and how they did it.
Yeah,
I've got a friend that can talk to Steve Gilchrist whenever he wants, and Steve doesn't know how they did it. And if he doesn't know, I don't know.
Nobody. And that's the same thing in that world too, is that just lost techniques and lost art and lost processes that we'll never quite know. And it's in the age of mass production, you don't have that kind of, and those were mass produced at the time, but it's a different kind of refinement and a different kind of precision that is hard to find in this world. And it's in the banjo world, one of the big mysteries is how did they make those metal clad rims? How did they make those spun over rims? And nobody really quite knows. And it was, going back to the metal spinning thing, they weren't actually spun. They were more fabricated and formed, and it was more lamp working techniques. And I've talked to a good friend of mine. It's just 10 minutes down the road. He's an antique. He makes antique lamp reproductions. So he's using old world lamp working techniques to create these brass and copper lamps. And I've talked to him about it. He said, this is 100% lamp working techniques. This came from, wire edges on, chandeliers and lamps and all these different shades and all these different things. But a lot of those techniques were lost. And it's like, yeah, I'm having to scratch my head all the time trying to figure out how did they do this and how did they do it so well and so efficiently. And that's one of the things I do really love too, is that kind of trying to solve those mysteries in a way, or recreate it in a way that works for our modern times.
Yeah. I think that's right. There's a lot of things like getting to the finish licks on like some of those old Martins. Like I was talking to somebody about it, and he's like, they were putting stuff in finishes back then that you just would never be able to put in. So you could just go ahead and give up on
definitely. Yeah, those guys probably died 20 years earlier.
Yeah, they died 20 years early because they were licking their fingers after sticking in the lead bucket.
Yeah.
But so yeah. Well,
and that's. Oh, go ahead. What are you saying?
Let's open things up for questions. I don't think we're going to get around to the banjo setup today. I want to have you come back and do something with banjo setup, but we're coming up
I'd love to do that
on 2 hours, and we gotta let everybody get back to this.
Well,
Connor, that's questions. I know Aaron wanted to know if you're making your own bridges. Are you making your own bridges?
Yeah, I am. I make a bunch of different designs, but the one that I've designed that I use the most is one that I based on a violin bridge. So I just took a violin, I was kind of thinking about the reasons why violin bridges are the way they are. and why they're designed the way they are. And I said, well, I wonder if the same principles would work on a banjo. So I took that kind of idea and squished it and stretched it out. And this is one that I make kind of based on that. And I've had a lot of success with it. I put it on all my banjos. I sell them individually for people, and they don't work for everything. Banjo bridges is a whole rabbit hole that, I know guys that have 300 bridges hanging around. They love swapping them around because it's amazing how much it can transform a banjo.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of the heart that in the head, and the head tension is a lot of the tone of the banjo. And the kind of head, the tension of the head, the bridge height, the tone ring, yes, kind of wood, little less so. It's kind of amazing how much variance you can find or you can get out of one banjo changing some of those components. So a lot of the tinkerers out there love tinkering with those elements.
I should say I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised. I remember came in with water buffalo horn bridge pins, and I scoffed at them, and then I threw them in, and I was like, oh man, come on, this does make a difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the bridge world is one that, like, this is a design I love and I like making it and it works for me, but it's a piece of the banjo world that I am overdue to go deeper into. And yeah? I make the traditional 3-foot bridges for people, and I do ones that are like a solid, I think it's called like a bridge or something, where it's solid and it has 5 holes through it. Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of different variations of bridges, but my buddy Noam Pikilny has gotten me really thinking about traditional banjo bridge design lately, of like the traditional 3-foot bridge and why it works so well, and it's inspired me to kind of set some time aside soon and get deeper into that and really try to refine one of those designs that I like. And it's a whole, and it's there's so many different elements of what will affect the tone of that, is like the wood, the structure of the grain, what you put on top of it, how thick that top piece is. There's so much that goes into what will, and it's amazing that I've sat there and A/B tests really similar bridges that look exactly the same with people that have really refined ears, and it's amazing what you'll hear, the differences. Like, wow, that one's total garbage, that one's amazing, I don't know why. It's really kind of fascinating.
Connor, you look like you had a question.
I was going to ask about the steam bending versus the block rims. Is it an aesthetic decision that you prefer steam bending, or is it efficiency as well? Like, do you regret not starting steam bending earlier?
No, I don't think I regret doing the block blade rims first at all and waiting to do the steam bent rims. It definitely is. It's kind of a mix of both aesthetic and structure, in my opinion, as far as and also longevity. So the one thing that I've noticed with most block rims, I think one of the few makers that I've seen really crack the block rims is Stelling with their rims. Their block rims are incredible. And I had an 80, pretty early Stelling for a while. That was a personal banjo of mine. That rim was beautiful after 30 plus years. But a lot of block rims, unless they're built really exceptional with really great precision, or the finish work is really well, or the wood's really seasoned well, they move. And those joints, having that much joinery in a rim, which is really just end grain to end grain, flat grain to flat grain, you get movement, and things like glue joints give out. Those end grain to end grain joints get a little weaker. So it's hard. We all know it's hard to glue end grain to end grain and have it stay together. And aesthetically, it's a different look, and they work well and they sound great. But I think, and part of it for me was also just keeping that tradition of the steam bent banjo rim. It really, to make wood round, it makes sense to bend it in a circle, kind of like a wood side, the side of a guitar. It makes sense to bend thin wood instead of cutting it out of one piece of wood. So I definitely don't regret starting there, because it taught me a lot. And it also, I still do segmented rings for wooden tone rings if I'm topping a steam bent rim. And I do occasionally have somebody say, hey, I want a block rim. And I go, no problem, I can do that. And I like having the flexibility of being able to do both. So it's a little bit tradition aesthetic, but I also have found that the laminated steam bent rim, there's probably as much glue, maybe more glue joinery, but it's a much more rigid rim over the long term because of how things move.
That's really interesting. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Great question.
How much is rim movement gonna, like, are banjos this susceptible to temperature and humidity changes as guitars, or are they?
It depends. Not as nearly as much as acoustic guitars in the extreme sense. So like you don't have the top deflection and the top sinking problems and that kind of thing, but you can have a banjo that is a nightmare in humid or really dry environments, depending. I have, over the years, I've made some banjos that I have to do, like, for instance, my friend Carling, who I have the duo with, I mentioned earlier, I made her a banjo years ago, and it's one that I'm so happy with it over the years, and she makes it sound amazing, but it's one I have to do yearly adjustments on the neck. And it's just a little truss rod tweak, really minor, but it moves every season. A lot of my other banjos, I don't see that issue with. It's just that particular piece of wood, and that's pretty minor. You'll get that. And there's that theory that I've talked to you about with some banjo makers and guitar makers that you go, if you put a truss rod in it, you're going to need to adjust it. If you build it rigid enough, you're not going to need to adjust it, because you can't, but it's not going to move as much. That's, one theory, taking that big chunk out of the middle of the neck. Mm-hmm. And then you have other elements in the banjo world, like a skin head, for instance. Some players like a calf skin or goat skin head. Those fluctuate pretty wildly. There's ways to tame it. You can treat the head, can seal the heads. They'll absorb less and let go of less moisture. But that affects the tension of the head, which affects the bridge height and the string relationship. So it depends on the banjo, depends on the setup. And it's a little bit more depends on the banjo than a guitar. Acoustic guitar, you can have some that are pretty impervious, but generally it's going to get affected if it dries out too much or gets too humid. You're going to really notice it.
Jackson, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what are you using for glue in general, but specifically with the rim laminations these days? I'm still using formaldehyde resin, which is the way Roger taught me. But just curious.
Yeah, I've actually played around with that a lot, and I've been bouncing back and forth lately. For a long time, coming from the furniture world and talking to a few luthiers early on, I was just using Titebond 1. And then in the last few years, I've played around with the LMI Luthier's glue, using that, and I've landed back on Titebond again. It's just a really great all-around wood glue that I've never really had much issues with, and it's so readily available everywhere that it's really nice to not have to deal with harder to find glues or glues I have to get shipped in or anything like that. And it's something with my rims I've actually planned on experimenting more, and I want to, with the new setup, with the speed of it, I've thought about trying to do some hide glue banjo rims, which I think is something that would be very interesting for some people, because it's something that it's how it used to be done. And I think there's a lot to be said with that glue, as we all know. What was the one you mentioned? I've never used it, but I am familiar with it a little bit.
Yeah, I think mine is I can't remember. It's a little red jar, and it's granules you dissolve in water, and then it dries up glass hard, but it does shatter if it's not in contact with wood consistently. And that was just when I was learning from Roger Simonoff, that's what he said he was using. So
and I wonder if that's something similar to what Gibson used to use.
That's I know that the red glue that was in some of their acoustics, like kind of like Cascamite era.
Could be, yeah. It's very red brown when it dries. And I know it was what Steinway was using for laminating all the piano stuff for a long time.
Interesting. Yeah. And the dry,
pretty
that's
dangerous.
one of the things I wanted to play with, is finding a glue that was a lot harder, that dried a lot harder than Type On does. My friend I mentioned, who I learned a bunch of the more advanced rim laminating techniques from, I got into that with him once, and he's like, I just keep going back to Type On, because most of the, that glue joint is so tight that you don't even have that much glue in there. And it's so it's in the way I dry them afterwards, it gets pretty hard. And I'd be surprised if you could really hear the difference at the end of the day. But I'm curious, because I'd like to try. That's one of the roads I'm planning on going down.
Right on. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I believe there's strength in the flexibility of Type On too.
Yeah, I agree. I really agree on that, because we all know wood never stops moving, and I think if you make something too rigid, it's gonna let go at some point.
Yeah, it does seem like it. Do we have any more questions? Aaron, I know you wanted to know about bridges. I think we got that. I got my eye open to banjo bridges, and is there anything that is there an opportunity for a rabbit hole on a bridge?
Do you sell those bridges, or are
Yeah.
they just builds?
Yep. No, I do sell them there. That you can buy them right on my website, seedersinstruments.com. Yeah.
And then are you just building but for commission builds, or do you have like standard models that you build and you'll sell to dealers occasionally?
Yeah, I do. Actually, that's something I've been restructuring how I do my business, and I've had the fortunate situation of having a waiting list when I went into this full time, and I've had a consistent 3 to 4 year waiting list my whole career doing this. Partially because I'm kind of slow, partially just because the banjo world's small and there's not a lot of guys like me. So I have the commission list that I do, but over the last number of years, I've found it really difficult to keep that moving well. So I've started to offer standard models, spec models. This is one that's in the works that doesn't have much inlay, and like the one I was just showing you guys earlier, that's going to be up for sale any day now once I get it photographed. So I have kind of 2 lists going, and even the standard models I offer direct for sale to people, there's still a waiting list for those because I just can't produce enough of them. But I have my custom build list that I'm working on and chipping away at. But then I have in between those, I'll make whatever I feel like making or what I know people are waiting for and just put them out for sale for those people. And I'm kind of working more towards leaning that way lately.
That sounds dangerous to your stated goal of trying to stay away from production.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I
think that's how like guys started. Oh, I'll just here's how I'll just do this one thing and it'll be just this thing. And next thing you know, you got 500 orders.
Yeah, totally. And that's, well, anybody that's waiting for those, I always kind of I always make sure they know, I'm like, there's no guarantee you're going to get what you want. You're just going to get what I want to make, and I vary them quite a bit. Yeah. And I'm only one guy, so I can only make so many. Yeah.
And Doug wanted to know earlier, and I glossed over his question, but he wanted to know how many you're cranking out in a year. Doug likes numbers.
It depends. Yeah. And it's funny. I've been doing this long enough that I should know exactly, but because I mix in some repair and restoration, it varies year to year and month to month. Mm-hmm. Right now, on average, I think I've made 12 to 18 or so a year, but I've been kind of pushing lower 20s, and I'm shooting to make around 30 banjos a year or so. And on average, I've been doing 3 to 4 every month and a half to 2 months. So I'm getting close to that. But then sometimes it'll slow down to a grinding halt when I do a bunch of restoration for a month or a bunch of repair for a month or 2.
Cool. Anybody else got any questions?
Just one more. I think you touched on it. Could we have you back to go over some banjo setup basics? I think you mentioned that. I'd love that, man.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that Ian and I initially talked about. And it's, I warned him, I was like, there's a lot to talk about here with this whole operation I've got going on. Didn't even get into the one of the new ventures of, making this kind of stuff.
Well, we can lead off next time. We can lead off with I'd like to see your CNC setup as well.
Yeah, we can do
so
that. Go through the metal shop as well. And next time I'll hopefully have a little more time to prepare to get things fired up and moving and more laid out more. But yeah, and definitely get into some setup stuff, because that's something if you're not a banjo player or maker or somebody's really into it, it's definitely a little bit of a mystery. And it took me a long time to get my head around some of it.
Yeah. Well, I noticed you used the word trigonometry, so it may.
Well, that's more in the finer points where, just to do basic setup work, you don't even need to. The one thing though that does that I can touch on a little bit with that is the flexibility of bridge height and string action. And that's one of the beauties that the banjo has over, a set neck guitar, for instance, is you have, unless the neck is underset, you have such a beautiful variation of bridge height that will give you whatever action you want. So typical setup is a 5/8 banjo bridge. I build using 11/16 bridges in mine, giving that if somebody wants a little bit lower action, you just throw a 5/8 bridge on. If you want a little higher, you put a 3/4 inch bridge on. If the neck moves a little bit, you have room to come down without ending up with a 1/4 inch banjo bridge, which just doesn't work. So you have variation in height to give you a lot of different fine adjustment in string height that you don't have as much adjustment in a set neck with a saddle, other than some electric guitars, for instance. And that's kind of one of a little bit of a forgotten about piece of the banjo setup world.
Cool. Well, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking the time. I will tell you the steam bent rims, that's a big deal, man. That is a big deal.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful setup you got. So anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I always love nerding out about what I do with people who appreciate the finer details.
I will send you some messages, and we'll get geared up to schedule the next one.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, everybody unmute and say thanks to Will. And
Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks for hanging out, guys.
Thanks, Will.
Sunday.
Thanks very
Enjoyed
much.
that.
All right, take care, guys.